Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The planet Viron gleamed like a jewel in the vast darkness of space. Once a quiet, overlooked world on the edge of the galactic frontier, Viron had become a symbol of rapid progress and unparalleled growth. Its cities, with towering spires of glass and metal, were home to innovators, scientists, and visionaries from across the galaxy. But the true power of Viron came from beneath the surface, an endless supply of Drexite, a rare mineral used to power the most advanced technologies in the universe. The future was theirs, or so it seemed. Kellen Morvn, a journalist in the capital city of Talonor, stood before the vast windows of his office, staring out at the bustling streets below. Vehicles zipped between buildings, their soft hums barely audible from this height. The world below seemed peaceful, almost idyllic, but Kellen knew better. An election loomed, and with it, the fate of their planet. Kellen had grown up believing in the promise of democracy. In school, they taught him that a free society could choose its destiny, that the people's will would always lead to progress. But as the election day approached, Kellen couldn't shake a sense of unease. Something had shifted in Viron. The air was thick with fear of the unknown, fear of outsiders. And that fear had given rise to the Viron First movement, a political party that promised to return the planet to its rightful owners and close its borders to all alien influence. "Kellen, are you listening?" asked Rhea, one of his fellow reporters, snapping him out of his thoughts. She sat at her desk across the room, surrounded by scattered news clippings and data feeds. "Yeah, sorry," Kellen replied, shaking his head. "Just thinking." "You're worried about the election, aren't you?" Rhea leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. "Aren't you?" Kellen responded. "We've seen the polling. Viron First could actually win." Rhea sighed. "People are scared. They think shutting out the galaxy is the answer." Argus, he knows how to play on that fear. General Argus, the name sent a chill through Kellen's spine. A former military commander, Argus had risen to prominence with his fiery speeches and promises to close Viron off from the rest of the galaxy. Under his leadership, Viron First had surged in popularity, fueled by the fear that aliens would exploit their resources and weaken their culture. But Kellen saw through it. Argus didn't want to protect Viron, he wanted control. "I just don't get it," Kellen muttered, turning away from the window. "How can people be so blind? Cutting ourselves off from the galaxy? That's suicide." "People don't always vote with reason," Rhea replied. "They vote with emotion, and right now, they're terrified." Argus is offering them an easy solution. Kellen nodded but said nothing. He returned to his desk, scanning through the latest reports. It was all the same: more rallies, more speeches, more promises of isolationism. The election was only days away, and Kellen knew the outcome would shape their world for generations. Election day came faster than expected. The streets of Talonor were filled with voters lining up at polling stations, their faces tense with anticipation. Kellen, ever the journalist, roamed the city with a small camera drone, capturing the mood of the people. There was an undercurrent of excitement, but also fear. Many felt this election was their last chance to reclaim control of their planet. The crowds at the Viron First rallies were the largest, their chants echoing through the streets: "Viron First, no more outsiders." As night fell, Kellen found himself back in his office, staring at the hollow screen as the votes were tallied. He could feel his stomach tightening with every update. The numbers were close, too close. But as the final results trickled in, the outcome became clear: Viron First had won. The announcement hit like a punch to the gut. Kellen felt the breath leave his body as the news anchor declared General Argus the new leader of Viron. Cheers erupted in the streets outside, but Kellen could only hear the sound of his heart pounding in his ears. "We're in trouble," he whispered to himself. Within days of the election, General Argus wasted no time enacting his agenda. The borders were sealed, and all trade agreements with neighboring star systems were cancelled. Alien workers, who had long been a part of Viron's success, were ordered to leave immediately. Argos gave a speech in the Talonor Square, his voice booming over the city's speakers. "No more will we allow outsiders to bleed our planet dry," Argos declared to thunderous applause. "Viron belongs to Virionians, we will rise on our own." Kellen watched from a distance, standing among the crowd, feeling a pit of dread growing in his stomach. He could see the faces around him, filled with hope, but it was a hope born of ignorance. They didn't understand the consequences. Kellen knew the galaxy wouldn't stand by and watch as Viron hoarded its resources. "We need to do something," Rhea said later that evening. They sat in Kellen's apartment, the lights dim, the city quiet outside. "Like what?" Kellen replied bitterly. "We're journalists, not revolutionaries." "We're the only ones left who are willing to speak the truth," Rio said, her voice firm. "If we don't act now, this planet is going to tear itself apart." Kellen knew she was right. He had spent his entire career believing in the power of words, in the ability of journalism to sway public opinion. But Argos' rise to power had shown him how easily people could be manipulated. Fear was a powerful weapon, and Argos wielded it expertly. The underground resistance began with just a handful of journalists, activists, and dissidents who refused to be silenced. They started publishing anonymous reports, exposing the true cost of Argos policies. The planet's economy, once thriving, was already beginning to falter. Alien investment had dried up, and the war for resources had only just begun. It wasn't long before Viron's militarization kicked into high gear. Argos directed the planetary defense forces to seize control of nearby asteroid belts rich in druxite, claiming they were essential for the planet's survival. Skirmishes broke out with neighboring star systems, but Argos framed it as necessary. "We must protect what is ours," he proclaimed in another speech, "or the galaxy will take it from us." The resistance movement grew, but so did Argos' grip on the planet. Kellen's reports were being censored more frequently, and Rhea had already been detained once for anti-patriotic activities. Fear gripped the population. Even those who disagreed with Argos stayed silent, afraid of being labeled as traitors. The tipping point came when Viron launched a surprise attack on a neutral star system, seizing control of a planet known for its vast energy reserves. The galactic community could no longer ignore Viron's aggression. In response, a coalition of nearby star systems formed to counter Viron's expansion. Kellen knew what was coming next. The galaxy wouldn't stand by while Viron continued its reckless pursuit of resources. War was inevitable, and Viron was outmatched. One evening, Kellen sat alone in his apartment, the distant hum of military transports echoing through the streets. The once bustling city of Talonor had grown quieter since the war began. Businesses were closing, and the streets were lined with recruitment posters for the planetary defense forces. A message appeared on Kellen's screen. It was from Rhea. "We need to talk tonight. Meet me at the usual place." Kellen knew what that meant. The underground movement was planning something big. He grabbed his jacket and left his apartment, blending into the shadows of the darkened streets. The Talonor Undercity was a maze of forgotten tunnels and abandoned buildings, a place where those who opposed Argos could meet in secret. Kellen arrived at the agreed-upon location, a dimly lit basement beneath an old warehouse. Inside, a group of familiar faces sat around a large table, holographic maps of the city and nearby star systems projected in the air above them. "We can't wait any longer," Rio said, her voice firm as she pointed to the map. "The coalition is preparing to strike. When they do, Argos will double down on his policies. If we don't act now, this planet will be reduced to ash." Kellen listened as Rhea outlined their plan, her voice steady, but filled with urgency. The underground movement had grown bolder, and the coalition's impending strike was forcing them into action. The resistance couldn't stop the war, but they hoped to expose Argos' lies, to show the population that this wasn't about defense or survival. It was about control, and Argos was leading them into ruin. "Information is our weapon," Rio said, glancing at Kellen. "If we can get the truth out before the coalition's assault, Maybe just maybe we can turn public opinion. But we have to move fast. Kellen knew the risk. Any attempt to broadcast anti-government material was met with harsh retaliation. Dissidents were being detained in droves, and any media not aligned with the state had been systematically shut down. Still, he couldn't shake the sense of duty. They had to try. How are we going to get past the censorship algorithms? He asked. We have a contact in the comms tower, Rhea said. They're sympathetic to our cause. We can patch into the planetary broadcast network for a few minutes, long enough to reach every household. After that, it's only a matter of time before the military shuts us down, but it'll be out there. Kellen hesitated. And if this fails? Rhea's face hardened. If this fails, we're all dead anyway. There wasn't much else to say. The plan was set in motion that night. Under the cover of darkness, Kellen and a small team made their way to the Central Communications Tower in Talonor, a massive structure that controlled all information coming in and out of the city. The streets were eerily quiet, the usual hum of activity replaced by the distant rumble of military transports preparing for war. Kellen's heart pounded in his chest as they approached the tower. The Resistance had a few insiders who worked in maintenance, and they were able to gain access through an old service entrance, bypassing the guards. The tower itself loomed above them, a symbol of the very control they sought to dismantle. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. The air was filled with the soft hum of machinery, and the sterile lights cast long shadows across the floor. Kellen could feel the weight of what they were about to do. They reached the control room, and Rhea quickly began setting up the broadcast. You're sure this will work? Kellen asked, standing by the console, his fingers trembling slightly. It has to, Rhea replied, her voice low. We don't have another option. Kellen watched as Rhea input the codes that would override the government's censorship software. The screen flickered, and a soft chime indicated they were live. His heart raced as he stepped in front of the camera, taking a deep breath. This was it. People of Iran, Kellen began, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. We have been lied to. He went on to explain the truth behind Dargah's rise to power, the false promises, the unnecessary war. He exposed the reality of the situation that Iran was not under threat from outsiders, but from its own leadership. The government had isolated them, militarized them, all in pursuit of control. Kellen knew he had only minutes before the military shut them down, but in those few minutes, he hoped to plant the seed of doubt in the minds of the people. The door to the control room burst open just as Kellen finished his final sentence. Soldiers stormed in, their rifles raised. Kellen raised his hands in surrender as they dragged him and Rhea away. The broadcast abruptly cut off. His heart sank. Had they reached anyone? Was it enough? The next few days were a blur. Kellen and the other resistance members were imprisoned in a high-security facility, their fates uncertain. The coalition's fleet had been spotted on the outskirts of the system, preparing for a final assault. Inside the prison, Kellen could hear the distant rumble of explosions as the war reached its climax. The once thriving city of Talonor had become a war zone. Coalition forces launched devastating strikes against military targets, but the damage wasn't limited to the armed forces. Civilian infrastructure was being destroyed in the crossfire. Buildings crumbled, fires raged, and the streets ran with panic. Kellen could only imagine the devastation unfolding outside the walls of his cell. Then, one evening, the air raid sirens began to wail. The ground shook violently beneath Kellen's feet, and the lights flickered as another round of bombardments hit the city. He could hear distant screams, the sound of buildings collapsing. This wasn't a battle, it was a massacre. Suddenly, the prison's power cut out completely. The emergency lights flickered on, casting a dim red glow over the corridors. Kellen heard shouts from the guards, confusion spreading through the facility. In the chaos, the magnetic locks on the cell doors disengaged. Kellen hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open, stepping into the hallway. Around him, prisoners were already making their escape, some fighting with guards, others slipping into the shadows. Kellen moved quickly, searching for Rhea. He found her a few cells down, disoriented but alive. "We need to get out of here," Kellen said, pulling her to her feet. Together, they made their way through the darkened halls, avoiding guards where they could. The facility was in disarray, with no clear leadership directing the defense. It was a free-for-all. Outside, the city was unrecognizable. Fires raged across the skyline, and the air was thick with smoke and ash. The Coalition's fleet hovered ominously in the sky, their weapons lighting up the night as they rained destruction on Viron. Kellen and Rhea moved through the chaos, trying to avoid both soldiers and falling debris. "This is it," Rhea said, coughing from the smoke. "Viron is finished." Kellen didn't respond. He knew she was right. The Coalition's forces had overwhelmed them, and Argos government was in shambles. There was no future for the planet as it once was. As they moved through the ruins of Talonor, Kellen couldn't help but think back to the beginning. The election, the promises of freedom, the hope for a brighter future. It all seemed so distant now, like a dream that had been shattered by the harsh reality of war. They reached a vantage point overlooking the city. Below them, the streets were filled with rubble, the once glistening spires of Talonor reduced to twisted metal and broken glass. The Coalition's ground forces had landed, securing key points across the planet. It was only a matter of time before they declared victory. But for Kellen, this wasn't a victory. It was a tragedy. An entire civilization brought to its knees, not by an outside force, but by its own choices. He could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, the realization that freedom, when misused, could lead to destruction. "We need to get this out there," Rhea said, her voice thick with emotion. "People need to know what happened here." Kellen nodded. "We will." They moved deeper into the city, finding a hidden shelter where other resistance members had gathered. There, Kellen began the work of documenting everything they had witnessed, everything that had led to this moment. It wasn't just a record for the people of Viron, it was a warning to the galaxy. As he wrote, Kellen knew that the galaxy would recover, that life would go on for those outside Viron. But for the people of this planet, their story was over. The war had reduced their civilization to ruins, and their once promising future had been snuffed out in a matter of weeks. In the end, Kellen wasn't sure if their broadcast had reached anyone, if it had made a difference. But he knew that history would remember Viron, not as a symbol of progress or freedom, but as a cautionary tale. A tale of how fear and isolation could destroy even the brightest of futures. The destruction of Viron was complete, but the lesson it left behind would echo across the galaxy for generations to come.